let's start our discussion on the revision questions first. This is actually a very interesting question. It tests you on your understanding on insulin, but I would like to discuss this graph with you as well so that you understand what is occurring in those diabetic patient and also those pre-diabetic patient. So here, this slide is the blood glucose level of Tom after eating a bagel. Okay, so which is containing a lot of sugar and some other carbohydrates as well. So after digestion, it would lead to of course, an increase in blood glucose level. So you see, even in a person who is normal, the blood glucose level increases after eating the bagel, right? Okay, so the question for you: after eating a bagel, blood glucose level increases in the first half an hour, even in this normal object. So before answering all these, my first question to you is, can you explain this increase in blood glucose level in the first half of an hour after eating the bagel? That after, especially after our first course, okay? So what happens during this first half an hour, which leads to this increase in blood glucose level? Both chemical digestions occur, and that leads to digesting those starch into disaccharide. And in the stomach, if those carbohydrates are already in monosaccharide form, they will be absorbed. And in the duodenum, a lot of monosaccharides and some digested disaccharide would be absorbed there as well. So digestion of carbohydrates occurs very fast because it starts in the mouth. And if the food contains a lot of simple sugar like monosaccharide, it will lead to a very sudden increase in blood glucose level. And we also talk about the uh, GI value before, which is used to measure the effect of food on blood glucose level changes. Okay, so these bagel containing a lot of sugar and carbohydrates is definitely going to lead to a very dramatic and sudden increase in blood glucose level, even in normal person here. Okay, but can you see that the level of increase is very different in these three people here, right? Okay, normal person, the increase is much less than Susie and Tom. Okay, this normal subject here, the increase is the level, maximum level is even lower than the other two person here. Okay, so it is because after the increase in blood glucose level, certain hormone would be secreted out. Okay, because of the negative feedback mechanism, the change in blood glucose level would stimulate the pancreas for secretion of certain hormone to regulate the blood glucose level. What is that hormone? Okay, that is the first question. that is asking here. Okay, insulin, very good. Okay, so for no person here, he can secrete insulin, and insulin can also take the effect. Okay, we don't know whether Susie or Tom are type 1 or type 2, no idea at all. We need to check the blood insulin level to verify that. Okay, but the curve here shows only the glucose level. Okay, so why do we need to check the blood insulin level before knowing that whether Tom is type 1 or type 2 diabetes? Know that he is diabetic, but we have no idea that whether he is type 1 or type 2. Okay, so we need to do another testing the blood insulin level, okay, to verify that. Okay, so why is that so? Under what situation can I say that he is type 1, and under what situation can I say he is type 2? Whether he can actually produce enough insulin or not. Okay, so if Tom, since he is diabetic here, so if Tom is not producing enough insulin, then he is type 1 diabetic. And if he can produce enough insulin, but still cannot restore the blood glucose level back to normal, then he is type 2. Definitely, the signaling pathway or the receptor is not sensitive to insulin. It is not the problem on production, and that is type 2 diabetes. Very good. Most of you get that. Okay, so second question here. After you know what hormone is being secreted, then you need to describe how this hormone brings the blood glucose level back to normal. Okay, so this is kind of straightforward. We go through this quite a number of times already now. Okay, so the hormonal regulation of blood glucose level is in a number of ways, helping the either help the conversion of blood glucose level into something not soluble, which is glycogen for storage, or promoting cellular intake, okay, promote other cells, other tissue cells to take up more glucose from the blood, use them up so that promote or decrease, lower the blood glucose level. Okay, besides that, inhibit glycolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. Okay, because you are already having a lot of glucose in the blood, so you would like to inhibit the conversion of glycogen into glucose. Furthermore, the glyconeogenesis process of glyconeogenesis would also be inhibited, which is the conversion of amino acid or fat into glucose. Okay. On these two questions. If not, then we'll look at these two curves here in greater detail. Okay, so we now know why the blood glucose level increases in the first half an hour after eating bagel. Okay, if this normal subject is eating something else like butter, the curve would be very different from this one. Okay, this increase in blood glucose level depends on the carbohydrate composition in the food. Okay, I think most of you get that now. Okay, now let's pay a little bit more attention to these other two curves here. Okay, so for these curve,
Hi, Dr. Lam, we cannot hear.
okay. Can you hear me now? Testing, testing, testing. 而家有冇啊？有啦。OK，咁要擺得好近先得呢個咪。Okay, so for the curve of Susie, you can see that Susie cannot respond to insulin very well. So the level of blood glucose, the blood glucose level actually increases to a level much higher than the normal subject. You can see nearly double, okay, the maximum level, okay. And these definitely exceed the reabsorption capacity of the nephron, okay. So when we talk about water homeostasis, why diabetic person secrete or excrete glucose in their urine is because when blood glucose level is that high, it absorb. Most of it cannot be reabsorbed because it exceeds the reabsorption capacity of testing. Okay, so for Susie, same thing happened. So if we test the urine of Susie, actually we can find small amount of glucose there as well. But we say that Susie is still in the state of pre-diabetic, okay? Because she can still restore this blood glucose level back to normal, but it takes a much longer time. When comparing to the normal subject, you can see that the blood glucose level is being restored back to a low concentration after a very short period of time, after around 1 hour, okay? But for Susie, much longer time. Okay, so Susie is at a stage of pre-diabetic. So for patients like Susie, if she undergoes weight loss or control the diet properly, actually there is still chances of restoring into a normal or healthy individual without any signs or bad effects of diabetes. Okay, so I would like to bring this point to you. So for some of you who are very concerned about your blood glucose level, if you are in the state of pre-diabetic, there's still chance. Don't give up. Okay, manage your diet, do more exercise, increase energy output. Okay, use those glucose up. Okay, you still have a chance to sensitize those receptor for insulin. Okay, so there is still a chance. But for people like Tom, you can see insulin or the signaling pathway of insulin does not have great effect, so cannot even restore that to low level. Okay, so most of those glucose in the blood would be excreted in the urine. Okay, so after those glucose are being excreted in the urine, you can see that Tom experienced quite a number of signs and symptoms like very thirsty and weight loss, but still very hungry all the time. Okay. On this, if not, that will talk about nervous system today. Okay. Today's lecture, we're going to talk about the nervous system, some neuroscience today. Okay, so in today's lecture, we'll talk about the organization and also function of the nervous system. So what is being included and called nervous system. And we will talk about how stimulus is being converted into electrical signal. So like you're now listening to this lecture, the audio, the sound is not electrical in nature, right? Especially for those of you in the lecture hall here. The sound wave is a mechanical wave. Okay, and other stimulus like touch or pressure or pain, those are not electrical. So we need to have a way to convert those signal into electrical signal because the nervous system transmit electrical signal. Okay, and we'll talk about how those signals are being converted into electrical signal. Okay, and how those signals are being transmitted, conducted along the nerve. Okay, so when you touch something, the stimulus that is felt by the skin of your hand, those receptors, convert the stimulus into the electric. And that signal is being conducted and transferred along nerve, passing the nerve from the fingertip and to the spine and goes to the brain. And your brain will interpret what type of stimulus is this. Okay, so today we'll talk about the conversion and the conduction of this type of stimulus. And we'll also identify the signal conduction across nerve. Okay, so not just within a single neuron. How about those signals kind of jump from one neuron to another neuron? So it's like you are having an electrical signal, you're having a wire, a circuit. The electricity can only be conducted within that circuit, right? But for neurons, they are not physically connected together. There is a gap between one neuron against another neuron. But that electrical signal needs to get through that gap to pass on to another one. So what is happening in between to allow this to happen? Okay, something very, very magical there. Okay, we'll also talk about the reflex arc as well. Okay, so what is occurring during the reflex arc and what is actually a reflex arc? Or what is the nervous system? We have divided into two parts, the central nervous system, the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, so located in the center of our body. Okay, that's why we call it central nervous system, the CNS. And other nerves and neurons located outside of the CNS, they are making up of this peripheral nervous system. Okay, so those neurons, the nerve inside the brain and the spinal cord, they are part of the central nervous system. Whatever neurons outside of the central nervous system, they belong to the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so those sensory receptors on your fingers, they belong to the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so we have sensory neuron, which are afferent neuron, which means that it detects, transmit those signals towards the central nervous system. Okay, and the afferent neuron transmit those signals from the central nervous system. Okay, so the afferent neurons in some of the case would be called the motor neuron as well, because the signal brings about a motion. okay, in most of the time, okay, or a response. Okay, for example, when you touch, maybe you would like to pick up your phone now and surf the net, okay, so, and once you touch your phone, okay, your finger detect the signal, the touch of your phone, okay, and that signal is being picked up by the sensory neuron and passed to the brain through the CNS to the brain. And your brain decide to unlock your phone, okay, so a signal will be sent from the brain to the muscles in your hand, okay, and that signal is being transmitted to the hand through the afferent neurons, okay. For those neurons connected to the skeletal muscle, they are also called motor neuron, okay, because an action is being bring about. Let me give you another example. Okay, so before, when we talk about digestive system, we say that we have cephalic phase, right? When we think of food, we start to make saliva and make more gastric juice. And those gastric juice or pancreatic juice, they will be secreted into the GI tract. And the secretion of those gastric secretion is also controlled by some smooth muscle surrounding the glands. Okay, so signals from the brain will be sent to those smooth muscle so that the glands will contract and allow those secretion to be pumped into the GI tract. Okay, and another example for you is when you're hungry, okay, the GI tract, the stomach contract and move, right? Okay, that is also bring about by the signal transmitted from the central nervous system to the smooth muscles of the organ or tissues. The central nerve or the nervous system is actually integration center. It needs to get information and decide what to do, decide what response to output. Okay, so there is a flow of information. Those stimulus that is detected from that is the result of the external environment, okay, will stimulate the sensor. Okay, so like the sensory neurons on the skin, and it will be converted into an input signal. And this input signal would be transmitted through the sensory neuron to the CNS, to the central nervous system. And inside the CNS would act as an integrating center to integrate different types of signals that is being transmitted to the CNS. And after the integration of these signals, it will output a signal. And this signal would be transmitted through the afferent neuron, most of the time, a motor neuron, to the skeletal muscle and bring about the response. Flow of information along the central nervous system, okay, and these could be seen in signals from the skin or from the other internal organs as well, okay, like signals from the blood going and being integrated in the central nervous system and output and signal to increase or decrease the heart rate. Okay, so you can see a flow of information to the CNS, and the CNS would coordinate, integrate all information it receives and output response. These coming slides is just for your reference. So yeah, we are not having an examination now. Okay, so it won't it actually is not being asked in your final assignment as well. Okay, so this is just a more detailed division of the organization of the central nervous system. Okay, so we can divide the central nervous system into afferent division and the afferent division. Okay, so for the peripheral nervous system, we can divide into these two division. Okay, so for the afferent division, signals goes into the CNS. So most of them are sensory neurons. Okay, most of them are sensory neurons. And besides sensory neurons, stimulus from the internal organ can also goes into the afferent division. Those maybe signals from the liver or from other internal organs, they can also get into the those signals can be transmitted into the CNS through this afferent division. For the afferent division, signals going out of the central nervous system. Okay, so for this division, we can divide it into two types. Autonomic, okay, we talked about this before. Autonomic nervous system controls most of those responses or a process automatically, like breathing, heartbeat, movement of the gastric, the GI tract when you are doing digestion, contraction of those smooth muscles surrounding the exocrine glands when you are doing digestion. Okay, so they do this automatically for you. Okay, you don't need to think of, okay, I have eaten a bagel. I need to secrete certain enzyme. I need to contract the smooth muscle surrounding these exocrine glands to output those digestive juice into the GI tract. Okay, you don't need to even think of that. Okay, they would do that automatically for you. And under this division, under this autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, we also talked about this before when we talk about the regulation of heartbeat. Yes, heartbeat, regulation of heartbeat is under the autonomic nervous system. And these two nervous systems, they are acting in opposite direction. One stimulate and another one inhibit. Okay, so they are acting in a way we call that antagonistic. Okay, so opposite in direction. Okay, opposite control. So this type of opposite control is actually very, very common in the biological system. Okay, so that you won't overstimulate or over inhibit certain things. Okay, so after you stimulate the increase in heartbeat, you need to have a way to bring it down as well. You need to have a break. Okay. Okay, so besides that, we also have the enteric nervous system. This nervous system is actually in some books or some literature, you may find it called the third brain. Okay, so what they call in as the third brain is actually some of the nerve cells found surrounding in the walls of the digestive tracts. Okay, so nothing mystic. Okay， 有啲人講到好神秘學説咁樣，唔係只係有一啲neurons 一啲neurons 喺個 digestive system 喺個 digestive tract 嘅 wall 上面。Okay, so it controls those digestive organs only. Okay. Okay, so the somatic motor neurons is what connecting the central nervous system with the skeletal muscle. Okay, so whatever movement that you do, they need a motor neuron to transmit those signals from the central nervous system, and this signal would goes to the skeletal muscle. And after that, the skeletal muscle will output the muscle contraction to bring about that movement. Here, I would like to elaborate that antagonistic control of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves again, okay, because we talked about this when we talk about the control of heartbeat and the beating force before, okay? So they are acting on or controlling the heartbeat in totally opposite way. That's why it is called antagonistic, okay? So the stimulation by the parasympathetic nerves will stimulate and increase the heart rate, while signals coming from the parasympathetic neurons would slow down heart rate. Okay, so you can see here again, they control heartbeat in totally opposite way. About the central nervous system. Okay, so the central nervous system, we have the brain and the spinal cord. And if we try to cut the brain and get a section, this is what we get. Okay, don't worry. This when we kind of do this type of slicing, you can see the outer cortex is what is darker in color, right? Pinkish gray in color. These are what we call the gray matter. Okay, and inside is white in color. They are called the white matter. Okay, so disease in the brain often result in decrease in gray matter. Okay, because the cell body of those neurons is being located in this gray matter. Okay, so any decrease in the gray matter is definitely going to lead to decrease in intellectual ability, like ability to memorize things or ability to speak, or that types of function that is controlled by the brain would be affected. Okay, and you can see for the brain, gray matter is outside, white matter inside. But if we get a cross section of the spinal cord, that is totally opposite. Okay, the gray matter inside, white matter outside. Okay, the gray matter is where we found the cell body. Okay, remember in our first course when we talk about the structure of the cell. Okay, the structure of the cell for mammalian cell, they all contain a nucleus, right? The neuron also. Okay, so the cell body contains the nucleus. Okay, the nucleus would, a lot of nucleus being packed here would result in a darker color. Okay, that's why it is called a gray matter. Okay, so for the brain, actually it is floating in our skull. Okay, most of us don't know that. Okay, we always think that our skull and inside we have the brain. That's it. Actually, the brain, because it is so delicate, okay, it is being protected with some fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid, and the brain is in actually flows in this type of fluid. Okay, and this fluid could be found in the brain and also in the spine as well. Okay, so the spine is also being filled with this type of fluid, and this fluid, the major function of it is to absorb shock. Okay, because when you run, when you walk, actually whatever motion that you produce due to the inertia of the brain, it will always kind of knocking on the wall of the skull, right? Okay, That's why we need to have some fluid to absorb this type of shock. Okay, so to protect this very delicate but very important organ. Besides that, the fluid is very well controlled in chemical composition. So to maintain a very stable chemical environment, okay, so the brain and blood that supply nutrients to the brain, there is a barrier in between. We call it blood-brain barrier. Okay, so not all chemicals in your blood is going to get to the brain. Okay, they need to get through that barrier. Okay, and this barrier ensures that the brain won't be affected by those changes occurring in the blood. Okay, so to ensure a more stable chemical environment, because the brain is very, very sensitive. It responds to small stimulation. Okay, if whatever chemical changes in your blood is going to get to the brain, then the brain will be very busy producing a lot of unwanted response. Actually, some diseases is caused by this type of defects in the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so with the blood-brain barrier, which which helps to maintain a very stable composition of the fluid that is surrounding the brain. Okay, a very stable chemical environment could be maintained for the brain.
Sorry, I couldn't hear again.
Okay, testing. 我睇下用呢個咪喎。testing。咪冇着綠色燈喎，哦，而家有啦，應該係咪聽到啦？testing。Okay. Okay, so besides maintaining a very stable chemical environment, these fluid also carry out diffusion, so exchange of materials with the brain, and helps to carry those waste away. Okay, so that's why we need to always maintain hydrated so that we can get rid of those waste produced by the brain, because the brain is using so much energy for integrating those signals and outputting an output signal. It uses a lot of energy. It carries out a lot of biochemical reactions. It also produces a lot of waste. So those waste need to be carried away. One of the way is by having diffusion with the fluid surrounding the brain, and it will be kind of flush away those waste. So if you would like to maintain very good brain health, you always need to stay hydrated as well. Okay. And the CNS is protected by bones. We have the skull protecting the brain. We have the vertebrae protecting the spine, because the CNS is so important. We just cannot risk it being damaged. Okay. have three parts. We have the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain, and we have the cerebellum, which is smaller in size, and last but not least, the brain stem. Okay, so each of these parts are responsible for different functions of the brain. First of all, for the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the human brain, account for the largest volume. We have two hemispheres. They are connected. Okay, and the cerebrum is related and responsible for higher brain function. Okay, so thinking, learning, these are higher brain function, memory, emotions. Okay, and also integrate all those signal senses coming from the sensory organs, like the tongue or the nose, okay, and speech and movement. Okay, so these are functions of the brain that we kind of take it for granted, but if we learn that, we will know that it is very, very difficult to recreate this in robots now, even though we are having artificial intelligence. And actually, artificial intelligence brings the idea of neural, okay, into robots. Okay, so what you are learning today is actually how those computer scientists make use of what is occurring in our brain and put it into a robot. And they would like to recreate all this, but it is actually very, very difficult. We, of course, can recreate robots can have very good memory. We are having very cheap storage now, but it is very difficult to even integrate sensors coming from the skin. Okay? Not to mention sensors coming from your nose and your taste bud. Very, very complicated. Okay, so we kind of take it for granted, but these are actually very complex process that even today we cannot reproduce this. Cerebrum has some very distinctive features. We have a mouse brain here and the human brain. Of course, their size would be very different. Okay, the size of a mouse brain would be very different from that of the human brain. But just by looking at its outlook, can you notice any difference? Between these two brains? Very wrinkled, but the mouse brain kind of smooth, right? So this type of folder structure found in the brain is kind of common in those mammals that is having high intelligence. Okay, and this folder structure increases the surface area to allow the brain to pack more neurons. Okay, the neurons is the cells that is transmitting and detecting those signals. So if you can pack more neurons in the brain, it's like you're having a more powerful CPU to do more computation for you. Okay? So the human brain needs more neuron, and you can see that it is highly folded to pack more neurons. And for other mammals, they are like dolphins. They're having a very big brain. At the same time, their brain is also very wrinkled, looking very like a human brain. But some of the species maybe is bigger in size as well. And for some species, they have disconnected left and right hemisphere so that they can maintain movement while they sleep. Okay, so very interesting features in those animal kingdom. But for us, you can see that our brain is very wrinkled so that provide more surface area to allow packing more neurons within a very small volume. For the brain, the gray matter is on the outside. So here, the gray matter you can see, and inside is the white matter. Okay, so for a human brain, the distribution of the gray matter and the white matter is opposite when compared to the spinal cord. Okay, we'll talk about that very soon. And here, if we look at the distribution of those neurons across the layers in the gray matter and white matter, you can see that the white matter only contains those fibers of the neuron. In fat, in lipid. Okay, that's why it is looking white in color. Yes. Okay, and the nucleus contains a lot of DNA, and the cell body also contains a lot of the cytoplasm, contains a lot of the organelles inside, so making it look much darker in color. The cell structure 嘅時候，我哋咪成日講 mammalian cell 圓圓地咁樣有個 cell membrane。咁嗰陣時講嘅時候係 in general，咁嗰陣時亦都有 point out 就係唔同嘅 cell type 嗰個樣可能有少少唔同嘅。而家 neuron 就正正係咁樣咯。你會揾到有 nucleus in the middle of the cell， 但係佢嗰個cell membrane， 你睇個 cell membrane 可以係 flow 到咁長，然之後中間亦都有少量嘅 cytoplasm， 咁就係每一個 cell 佢其實我哋上次講嘅 cell structure 入面嘅 organelle、cytoplasm、cell membrane 佢全部都有嘅 ，OK， 但係咧佢亦都會有佢自己獨特嘅形狀啊，去 fit 翻佢嗰個 function。Okay, so neuron is one of the example. Another example that I would suggest to you is a Rappert cell. Okay, Rappert cell is also a kind of mammalian cell, right? But for because of its function, it has a very special shape as well, a biconcave shape, and it loses the nucleus to pack more hemoglobin after it mature. Okay, so the message that I would like to bring out is that when we talk about the cell structure of the mammalian cell, in the first course, we discussed every organelles and the structure of the cell membrane and cytoplasm already. But for cells that are found in different organs or tissues, they would have very distinctive either features or shape or outlook when compared with each other. For example, some would contain more mitochondria, some would contain more smooth ER, or some would contain more rough ER. That would depend on its function. Okay. For the white matter outside, you can see it is only consists of mainly the fiber here. And this fiber, we give it a special name called axon. Soon, I will introduce you again to this term, the axon, in the coming slide. Okay, after talking about the biggest portion of the human brain, the cerebrum, there's this small part which is located underneath the cerebrum is called the cerebellum. Okay, this cerebellum is involved in coordinating a lot of movement and very important in maintaining balance. So for professional dancer, after years of trainings in carrying out a lot of difficult or movement that needs very precise coordination, they have slightly bigger cerebellum. Okay, and this was actually found in a lot of aerobatic athletes as well, 啲空中特技員嗰啲，they have a cerebellum slightly bigger than normal individual. Okay, because they need to carry out very precise movement. They need to have very good balance, and after years of training, the cerebellum increases in size as well. Okay, so it's like in human body, the more you use that, the better it becomes. Okay, so for the brain, it is always true. The more you use your brain, the better it becomes. This is the brainstem. In some of the case, we call it medulla. Okay, and the brainstem is involved in a lot of involuntary action. Okay, so what are involuntary actions? Those actions that heart rate, swallowing, and blood pressure. Okay, so these are being controlled involuntarily. Okay, I'm not saying that you cannot control your breathing by will. You can control that. So basically, the basic rate of heartbeat of breathing would be controlled by the medulla. Okay, but you can also output a signal from the cerebrum to override this signal coming from the brainstem, okay, to control the breathing as you like. Okay, but we have other controlling center that would outright this control when certain condition happens. It's like when you're holding your breath, you can control it by will, right? Telling yourself to hold the breath. But there is always time that you cannot hold it anymore. Okay, because other signals being detected gets into the central nervous system, and those signals would override the signal coming from the cerebrum to allow the breathing action to occur again. Okay, to override that action. Okay, so that the body can get oxygen to replenish the increase in carbon dioxide, and also the replenish for the decrease in oxygen. For the spinal cord, one of the feature that is very, very different from the brain is the distribution of the gray matter and the white matter. Okay, so for the spinal cord, the gray matter is located in the middle of the spinal cord, but the white matter outside. So the cell body is being found in the middle. Okay, but the fiber outside. Okay, so most of the time you can find the fiber outside of the spinal cord, and these would be the major composition of the white matter. Okay. And bridge between the peripheral central nervous system with the central nervous system. You need a communication between this, and the spinal cord would be the communication bridge for the sensory neurons or motor neurons to talk with the central nervous system. Okay, so signals need to get to the spinal cord, and after being integrated there, would transmit it to the central nervous system, to the brain, and the brain, after interpreting that signal, would output and signal to go to the spinal cord again, and gets to target to output and response. Okay, so the spinal cord is the communication bridge here, and damage of the spinal cord will affect the communication here. Okay, so it depends on the location of that damage. Okay, so if that damage is located at the lower part of the vertebrae, maybe the lower body is being affected only. Okay, because the sensory information now cannot be transmitted through the spinal cord up to the brain. So the brain actually cannot get the signal, even though stimulation is being detected by the sensory neuron, but the information cannot go up to the brain. So the brain gets no information from that. Therefore, no signal could be output. Okay, but for these people who are having damage on the spinal cord, they still have the spinal reflex, because the spinal reflex only involve the spinal cord, not the brain. Okay, we'll talk about reflex in later part of today's lecture, and you'll know why. Okay. Same as reflex art. Okay, you're right, but reflex art, we describe every component in that art. Summary of the function of the CNS for the cerebrum mainly involved in a lot of high brain function, thinking, emotion, and coordinating some movement as well. For the cerebrum, mainly coordinating and fine-tuning certain motion and maintain body balance. And for the brainstem, controls a lot of involuntary actions, okay, like heartbeat and breathing. That's why when doctor need to certify certain patient, they would check, first of all, they would check if there is still reflex, okay? And for some country, they will require the doctors to check if the spine or the brainstem is not functioning anymore, okay? Because the brainstem controls involuntary actions like breathing and heartbeat. If the brainstem sound? Testing. Testing. 係咪啊？有啦。Okay. So for this spinal cord mainly act as our communication link between the brain and the rest of the body, and it is involved in a number of very important reflex, and we'll talk about that very soon. Let's talk about neurons. We kind of mentioned this term a number of times. So what is actually a neuron? Okay. So a neuron is you can see as a basic functional unit of the brain, of the central nervous system. Okay. So a neuron looks like this. Okay. It's a very specialized cell. Okay. Each neuron is actually a cell, but it looks really weird, right? So we have different types of neuron. They look a little bit different. We have sensory neurons. For sensory neurons, the cell body is located outside and it has some dendrites and axons. So what are dendrites? Dendrites are structures looking like a tree, okay, spreading out so that it can increase the surface area to get as much signal input as possible. Okay, so signals goes into the neuron through the dendrites. Okay, so signals come from here and gets into the neuron. How about the axon? The axons are the portion of the neuron that signals goes out. Sensory neurons, you can find that the cell body is located outside and a kind of not in the middle in this straight line here, so a little bit outside, and it has a lot of dendrites, allowing to a lot of input to be collected and gets into the cell body. After integration of the signal will be output to the axon. Other types of neuron called interneuron. So its names already suggest you the function. It is a neuron that connect other neurons. That's why it is called interneuron. So it is a neuron that connects the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So in between here. So that's why it is called interneuron. And that is also why it looks like this. Because it needs to get information from this end, goes into interneuron, integrate certain information, and output those neurons to those signals to another neuron. Okay, so it needs a lot of input and a lot of output size as well. Well, it connects the central nervous system with the effectors, okay, like organs or skeletal muscles, okay. So signals get from the maybe the interneuron would be goes into a cell body and transmitted through the axon to the effector, to the skeletal muscle, to output a response. Okay, so有冇聲 ？Sorry， 我應該要點做？係咪啊 ？Testing，點解會咁㗎
？Doctor Lemon 唔好意思，因為嗰個聲咧，其實係 keep 成堂咧都係有下冇下咁啊。
我知啊，等我睇下而家可以點樣做先。Speakers, it takes microphone line in 係咯 line in 啦已經。testing 有冇嘢嚟㗎 ？testing 係咯，個綠色嘅聲好似多啲。Okay, testing, can you hear me? Testing, 係咪得唔得？嗰個嚟嘅喎，係咯，冇乜 signal。testing， 呢個好似好啲喎，係咪 ？testing， 冇，唔係好啲，OK， 有冇好啲啊？冇好啲嚟㗎。But echo 啊。斷係咪？係咯，我都見到佢個 signal 唔係太 strong， 係咪好啲 ？OK，this one is clear， 咁就用住呢個先。OK， 講到邊啊頭先？啊係啦，咁我哋而家就將呢三個 neurons 擺喺我哋個 central nervous system 同埋個peripheral 嘅 nervous system， 睇下佢哋係喺咩位置。OK。For peripheral nervous system, it includes all those neurons that is outside of the central nervous system. That is a definition for the peripheral nervous system, right? Okay. So sensory neurons, let's say those sensory neurons or receptors on your skin. okay, on your fingertips. Those are neurons that is located outside of the central nervous system. And let me maybe use one example. Those are pain receptor on your finger. Receptors would be on the skin, and this part would goes all the way along your finger to your arm and connect to the central nervous system. So you can see that each neuron could be having very, very different length. It depends on 佢個 location， 有啲 neurons 係好長嘅。OK， 咁最長嘅嗰條 neurons 係邊一條咧？就係喺我哋嘅 hip 嗰度出嚟，然之後一路伸延到去你腳板底嗰啲 neurons。OK， 所以當你受傷嘅時候，腳受傷嘅時候，可能 cut 啊定乜嘢咧？如果佢傷咗呢一個 neurons 中間嘅位置嘅時候，咁佢都會個 signal 冇辦法可以傳輸到嘅。佢都可以喺個長度都可以爭好遠嘅。咁我哋手上面嘅嗰啲 sensory receptors， 呢啲 sensory receptors， 佢個 receptor 就喺我哋 skin 啦，佢會個 surface area 好大啦 ，so that 佢可以 pick up 最多嘅 signals。And these signals that is being picked up convert into electrical signal goes all the way along these neurons and goes to the axons here. Okay, after passing the cell body, goes to the axon and get to the interneuron in the spinal cord. Okay, for the interneuron, it locates only in the central nervous system, most of the time in the spinal cord. And after integration there, signal integration there, output signal goes to the cell body of the motor neuron. So the motor neuron have the axon that is very long again, goes out of the central nervous system and goes all the way to the effector muscle. Okay, so 最長嘅 motor neuron 係邊條？又係喺我哋個尾龍骨嗰度出嚟，去你腳嘅嗰啲 muscle。係啦，咁你今晚翻去喐下啲腳趾嘅時候，你其實就係 control 緊 output 緊呢個 signal 去係啦，你腳趾上面嘅嗰啲 muscle 去有一個可能喐下腳趾 contraction 嘅一個 movement。OK， 咁嗰條其實你就係用緊呢啲motor neuron to output the signal to the skeletal muscles in your big toe maybe. Let's have a short check your understanding here. Okay, let me give you 1 minute to go through this. What is your answer, okay, for this question? Okay. Which type of neuron transmit a signal from the central nervous system to an effector? Okay, the sensory neuron transmit a signal from the sensory organs to the central nervous system. But the motor neuron transmit that signal from the central nervous system. Okay, and axon is part of the neuron. Okay. It is not the whole neuron, just certain part of the neuron, which transmit that signal out of the cell body to the next neuron or to the target. Okay, so this part is the axon. So what is a synapse? A synapse is what we are going to talk about in later part of today's lecture as well. Okay, so this is the gap between one neuron to another neuron. Okay, so we'll talk about this very soon as well. We have different types of neurons. They look very different because their function are quite different as well. And for the neuron, they all have a basic structure looking like this. They all have a cell body, which as a central control integrates signals together. And inside the the cell body of a neuron will have the nucleus containing DNA and all the organelles. Okay, because of the nucleus and organelles, it makes it darker in color. That's why the gray matter looks dark, because the gray matter is where we found all the cell body of the neuron. And the dendrites are regions that the neurons receive those incoming informations. Okay, inputs goes into the cell body, and these signals, after integrated in the cell body, will be transmitted to the axon. Okay, so the axon is where those signals would be transmitted out from the cell body. Okay, so the dendrite is very highly branched to increase surface area to ensure more input could be collected. Okay, the axon is where those signals would be output and have transmitted to the next neuron. Okay, so the length of the axon neurons. Okay, some could be more than a meter in length. Like that neuron I just told you, controlling and sending message from the spinal cord to muscles in your big toe. Okay, more than a meter in length, depending on your height. Okay, some would be only a few micrometers. Okay, so what is micrometers? We know what is cm, right? 1米就有100厘米。Okay，micrometers 係講緊10嘅負6次，即係1 over 10嘅6次方咁多米，咁就係 micrometer。So short in length. For neurons, they have some structural adaptations as well. So neurons most of them has highly branched dendrites. Okay, so to increase the surface area to get more signal input. Besides that, the axon of most neurons, they are myelinated. So what is myelinated? The axon of neurons are either surrounded by Schwann cell or oligodendrocytes. Okay, so these two types of cells are very, very special, especially these Schwann, especially the Schwann cell. They kind of wrap around the axon. Okay, and since the cell membrane is very, very rich in lipid, and lipid is insulator, okay, insulated to electrical signal. So with these cells wrapping around the axon, which transmit electrical signals, It's like you are having a plastic wrapping around the copper wire to avoid those electrical signal from leaking out. cell 我再講多次啊，佢個 structure 咧就好特別嘅，佢嗰個cell 咧係會 wrap around 嗰個 axon，咁就好似呢啲叫咩啊？係咪千層蛋糕咁樣一層一層咁樣搭上去？咁佢搭完之後，中間有 cytoplasm 噶嘛？你 cell membrane 中間有 cytoplasm 噶嘛？啲 cytoplasm 會 squeeze away。所以咧，即係變咗你有千層嘅 cell membrane 喺度，而 cell membrane 嘅 major composition 係乜嘢？係 lipid 啊嘛 ，lipid 係唔導電噶嘛，係啦，佢係 insulator 嚟嘅，所以咧你就好似包咗成千層，都唔可以講成千層，你包咗好多層嘅嗰啲叫咩啊？電線膠布喺條電線度咁樣。咁你啲 electrical signal that is transmitted along the axon 就可以一路咁樣 stay inside，okay？ 咁你就避免啲 signal 漏咗出嚟啦。因為你漏咗出嚟嘅時候，佢一路 transmit 落去就會越嚟越弱啊嘛。OK， 所以你需要有呢啲 cell wrap around。咁 Schwann cell 同埋另外一種 cell 都係同樣嘅作用啦，會做呢一樣嘢。只不過 Schwann cell 咧就喺個 PNS 嗰度，即係喺啲 sensory neuron 啊，或者喺啲 motor neuron 度，佢 wrap 住佢。而另外呢個嘅wrapping around 咧係 occur in the CNS，mainly in the brain。Okay？ 所以如果咧喺個大腦度啦，呢一種 cell 呢個我哋個dendrites 咧嗰個數量減少啦，係會影響到啲neurons in the brain 佢呢個 wrapping 嘅，咁即係話好容易漏晒啲 signal 啦，咁於是啲 signal 咪冇傳得咁好咯，係啦，咁呢個亦都係好多唔同嘅neuron disease 佢背後嗰個病嗰個 mechanism 喺度。Okay, so this lipid-rich cell wrapping around the axon provide certain function. First of all, it provides support. Okay, 你有好多層嘅cell membrane wrapping around， 咁佢就會 protect and support the axon. Okay, but more importantly, it acts as an electrical insulator. Okay, provide electrical insulations. So it speeds up signal transmission. Okay， 一嚟佢減少咗 signal 外流啦，二嚟咧啲 signal 咧唔需要一路即係呢個電嘅 electrical signal 咧，佢個傳送嘅過程入面同我哋平時啲電咧就有啲唔同嘅。平時啲電咧你喺入面嗰條電線咁樣流動噶嘛。咁但係我哋而家呢個 electrical signal 咧，如果佢中間有呢一啲嘅 fat 喺度包住咧，佢就可以咁樣跳啊。咁佢咁樣跳嘅時候咧，就會快好多嘅。因此咧，佢可以 speed up 個 signal transmission。Okay？ 一陣間你就會明白點解佢會係咁跳，兼且點解跳嘅話會快好多。因為我哋呢個 electrical signal， 佢係需要開同埋關好多嘅 channels 去達至呢一個 electrical signal。咁如果佢一路咁樣開關嘅時候，先至可以傳送過嚟嘅時候咧，係非常之慢。但係如果我淨係開呢個位，開關嘅 channels protein 就會少好多啦。因此就會快好多啦，呢個 signal transmission。咁我哋好快就會講下究竟有啲咩 channels protein 要開啊，點解要開啦，開完之後發生咩事。Okay, so before I introduce you to all those channels proteins that are being opened or closed, I need to introduce you to this very, very important concept in nervous system, okay, which is the action potential. Okay, so the electrical signal that is transmitted by the neuron is first of all, it is electrical in nature. Okay, we'll talk about how we convert those mechanical signal into electrical signal very soon. Okay, but the action potential refers to the potential, the voltage that is reverse in the polarity occurring in the neuron. Okay，乜嘢叫做 reverse in polarity 咧？首先，我哋要知道乜嘢叫做 polarity 先。polarity 即係唔係零咯，個 voltage 唔係零，佢係 either negative 或者 positive， 咁就叫做 polarize。OK， 咁就叫做有一個 polarity。咁when the neuron is at rest, the polarity of the neuron is negative， 得唔得？呢個係一個好重要嘅 concept， 我一陣間會話俾大家聽點解佢會係 negative。OK， 但係咧，喺好早期嘅實驗入面咧，即係啲 neuroscience 嘅實驗入面，佢哋係捉啲好大隻嘅深海八爪魚翻嚟。咁啲好大隻深海八爪魚咧，佢哋觸鬚上面咧，你就可以揾到一整條好長嘅 neuron。咁當時佢哋就插一個咁樣嘅 electrode 落去度嗰度嘅電啦。咁個 cell 嘅入面，個 neuron 嘅入面同埋出面去度嗰個 difference。咁佢哋就發現 ，OK 個 neuron 嘅入面係 always negative in voltage 嘅。當佢 at rest 嘅時候，再講一次啊，係度緊個 cell 嘅 membrane 嘅入面同埋出面。咁個 cell 當佢 at rest 嘅時候係一個 negative 嘅 voltage。Okay? 由於佢係一個 negative 嘅 voltage， 所以我哋會話佢係 polarize， 有一個 polarity 喺嗰度。咁當有個 stimulation， 呢個 stimulation 會 reverse 呢個 polarity。咁點解佢會 reverse polarity？ By open and closing certain channels protein to allow some sodium ion, potassium ions to go in and out。你一個 flow of charge ions 嘅時候，你就可以影響個 charge， 得唔得？So it will lead to a reverse in polarity from negative to positive. Okay, and this reverse in polarity is called action potential. Okay, and this the action potential would only be generated if the stimulation is able to generate a change in voltage, which is higher than the threshold。好嘅，咁只有當呢個 threshold 係過咗，先至會 generate 呢個 full height 嘅 action potential。個 generation 係 all or nothing， 你 either 有或者係完全製造唔到呢個 action potential。咁只有當製造到呢個 action potential 個 signal 先至會出現，得唔得？咁呢個 threshold 咧就好似一個 filter 咁樣啦。少少嘅 changes 或少少嘅 stimulation， 你係唔會發現到嘅，因為 being filtered out。Okay, this kind of protect the whole system from overstimulation. Concept here. One, first of all, what is action potential, which is generated only when the stimulation can create a change in the polarity that exceeds the threshold. Okay, and secondly, what is a threshold, which is the minimum potential that filter out that the signal must exceed, must reach, so that an actual action potential could be generated. OK， 暫時嚟講，你哋未知道咩係 depolarization， 咩係 polarization 嘅，唔緊要，我哋跟住會講噶啦。但係而家咧。 我哋要先講下究竟點解入面會係一個 negative 嘅 potential 咧？即係一開頭嘅時候，點解 at rest 嘅時候，當你冇 stimulation 嘅時候，佢係 negative 嘅咧？好啦，咁而家我哋就講啦。個 resting potential、membrane potential， 首先 first of all 係 negative 嘅，呢個一定要知道。咁點解佢係 negative? Why it is negative in voltage is because of the imbalance distribution of iron. 好啦 ，recall 翻你嘅 chemistry 學嘅嘢啦。iron 我哋有 positive iron 或者 negative iron 噶嘛，佢哋有 charge 噶嘛，係咪？咁當嗰個啲 ions 嘅 distribution across the cell membrane is imbalance， 就係有正有負啦。當你有 imbalance of charge 嘅時候，咁你就有一個voltage 有一個 potential， 你就可以度到嗰個 charge。distribution across the cell membrane. Okay, first of all, we have some channels proteins or pumps on the cell membrane. Okay, and these pumps are called sodium potassium pump. And these pump out 3 sodium ions, but only pump in 2 sodium ions. 個 pump 呢個 pump 係非常之 bias 嘅 pump， 咁佢咧 pump out 3粒 sodium ion 先至會 pump in 2粒 potassium ion。ions and potassium ions, they are one positive charge, right? 係咪？大家都係一個正 charge 嘅啫，呢個 sodium ion 同 potassium ion。咁當呢個 pump 咧 pump out sodium ion 3粒 ，at the same time 佢會 pump in 2粒 potassium ion。咁你淨係 compare 3粒嘅 potassium sodium ion 同埋2粒 potassium ion 嘅時候，入面係咪少過出面1粒正 charge 啊？charge 咧係一個 relative concept， 大家都係正 charge 㗎，只係我少過佢一個正 charge， 我就會係 relatively negative。之外咧，仲有另外一樣嘢咧，都導致呢個 imbalance ion distribution，which leads to this negative resting membrane potential。就係個 membrane 嘅permeability to potassium ion and sodium ion is also very different。咁咧個 membrane 係 more permeable to potassium ions than sodium ions。咁呢個 pump 咪會 pump out 啲 sodium ion 嘅，咁 potassium ion 就 pump in 啦。咁 potassium ion 理論上就喺入面就 higher concentration than outside，so 佢會有一個 diffusion out of the cell membrane， 係咪？而 potassium sodium ion 咧就調翻轉啦，出面高過入面嘅，所以有個 diffusion into the cytoplasm into the cell。得唔得？呢個 direction 大家 O 唔 OK 先？因為你不停喺度 pump out 又 pump in， 所以你 establish 呢個 concentration gradient for diffusion。咁佢有呢個 diffusion 之後咧，由於佢個 permeability for these ions are very different， 所以多啲嘅 potassium ions will diffuse out than those sodium ions getting into the cell。咁 ion 出翻去，但係少啲 sodium ion 入翻嚟嘅時候，咁入面呢個 relative negative charge 咪更加 negative 咯。嘢第一，你有個 pump 不停喺度 pump， 而嗰個 pumping 嘅 number in 同 out 係 imbalance 嘅。第二就係個 cell membrane 嗰個permeability to these two types of ions are different. So this result more positive ion outside and less positive ions inside of the cell membrane, inside of the cell. Okay, and finally, of course, it will reach an equilibrium. Okay, reaching an equilibrium doesn't mean that no ions is going out or in. It just means that the number of ions going out and in is equal now. That is what equilibrium means. Okay, it doesn't mean that no movement. It means that the number reach equilibrium. The number is the same. Okay, so due to this imbalanced distribution of ion, then more positive ions outside than inside. Therefore, when comparing the potential, the voltage of inside using outside as ground, 咩叫做 ground 㗎？㗎嘛，入面就度嗰個 voltage，ground 就係零咁嘅意思。如果你定咗出面呢個比較靜啲嘅 voltage 作為零嘅話，咁入面咪變成 negative 咯。就 summarize 一下先。咁呢一度咧，首先係resting 嘅時候啦，即係冇 stimulation 嘅時候，咁咧個 neuron 入面同埋個出面係有個 imbalance 嘅 ion distribution， 而呢個 imbalance 嘅 ion distribution 係有兩個情況而導致嘅。第一，喺個 membrane 上面有啲 pump 喺度啦，呢個 sodium potassium pump。咁呢個 pump 咧會 pump out sodium ions， pump in potassium ion， 但個 number 係 not equal 嘅，佢會 pump out 3粒 sodium ion， 但係先至會 pump in 2粒嘅 potassium ion。所以淨係睇呢個 pump 咧，我哋已經見到有個 imbalance distribution of ions 啦。Although they are both positive， 但係你入面係少過出面一個 positive charge。At the same time， 個 membrane 個diffusion 嗰個permeability to these two ions they are very different， 得唔得 ？Potassium ions 咧係容易啲 diffuse 翻出去嘅。而 sodium ions 係難啲 diffuse 翻入嚟嘅，呢個同個chemical properties of the cell membrane 同埋呢啲 ions 有關，係啦，咁就會令到由於多啲 potassium ion 走翻出去，少啲 sodium ion 走翻入嚟，所以你會加劇咗呢一個 imbalance ions 嘅情況。OK， 咁於是咧，你就會發現咧，入面咧係少正 charge 嘅 ion 過出面嘅，有個 relatively negative 嘅 charge， 即係 relatively 冇咁 positive 啦。咁由於咧，我哋喺度呢個 charge 嘅時候，我哋定義咗出面為之零，佢係 grounded。咁所以入面呢個冇咁正嘅就會變成負啦。OK， 咁呢啲喺用呢啲電咪錶去度嘅時候，你有個 ground， 咁 ground 就會定義為零啦。即係平時你嗰啲接地線接地嘅嗰條線就係講緊就係零嘅嗰一條啦。咁而家你入面嗰個係冇咁多 positive charge ions 噶嘛，個 concentration 係低過出面嘅，而出面高啲 positive ions concentration 嘅定義為零嘅話，咁入面呢個就會相對地就會係負啦。So the negative increases as time goes by. Actually 唔使等 time goes by， 當你有個 stimulation 嘅時候，佢就會 increase。 得唔得？你冇 stimulation 嘅時候，佢就會 maintain at 嗰個 voltage，嗰個 resting voltage，因為呢啲 pumps 不停喺度 pump，然之後呢啲 diffusion occurs，佢會 reach 一個 equilibrium，而嗰個 equilibrium 就係呢一個 voltage 啊，得唔得？所以正常 normal 嘅話，唔 under stimulation，一個 healthy 嘅 individual 係應該會 maintain 呢一個 minimum voltage 嘅。但係如果有病嘅話，咁又係有問題㗎啦，得唔得？咁而家知道個 resting membrane potential 點解係 negative 之後咧，我哋就要講另一件事啦，就係個 depolarization。咁個 depolarization 講緊嘅就係呢一個 process。OK， 咁我哋知道乜嘢係 polarity 啦嘛，係咪 ？polarity 就係講緊佢有一個 charge 啦，喺我哋呢個 case 係一個 negative 嘅 potential 啦。depolarization 即係話令到佢冇咁 deviate from zero， 咁就叫做 depolarization， 因為佢有一個 negative charge 就叫做 polarize 啊嘛。咁而家你將佢增加翻去翻接近零咧，咁就呢個 phase 咧就叫做 depolarization。OK， 咁你就發現咧，隔離呢邊就叫 repolarization， 因為佢 restore 翻佢呢個 negative voltage。Okay, so now let's have a look at what is happening during the phase called depolarization. Okay, for depolarization, it is the phase that makes the membrane potential less polarized. Okay, so increase in the membrane potential. Okay, so how is it being accomplished? How the voltage is being increased from negative and goes up and even shoot over zero is by the inflow of potassium or inflow of sodium ions. Okay, so sodium ions after stimulation, under stimulation, those sodium channels would open, and with the opening of the sodium channels, sodium ions would go into the cell. Sodium ions are positive in charge. When more sodium ions gets into the cell, is strong enough, this rising potential overshoot the threshold, then what happens is that more potassium channels opens to allow even more increase in the potential。咁得呢個係當你有一個 stimulation 嘅時候咧，咁你就有一啲嘅 sodium ions channels 咧就會開咗。咁佢開咗嘅時候，出面嘅 sodium ions 就可以 get into the cell。咁 sodium ions 係正噶嘛，正 charge 噶嘛，咁就會令到入面嗰個負嘅 potential 冇咁負啦，咁咧，咁會 increases 個 membrane potential， 你會見到有個 rising phase 喺度。咁當佢 reach exceed 呢個 threshold 嘅時候咧，what happened is that it enter into this rising phase of action potential。咁你就過咗個 threshold 就可以 initiate 呢個 action potential。咁當呢個第三個 phase 呢個發生嘅係咩事咧？即係點樣 generate 呢個 action potential 咧？就係 even more sodium ions channels opens， 咁就更加多嘅 sodium ions channels opens。而呢啲 sodium ions channels 咧，同呢一個 phase 第二 phase 嘅 sodium ions channel 係有啲唔同嘅。佢點唔同咧？就係呢啲 sodium ions channels 係 most of them are voltage gated， 得唔得？即係話只有當佢 detect 到某一個 membrane potential， 佢先至會開嘅。membrane 上面係有呢啲咁樣嘅 channels protein 㗎，好有趣。有啲係 長時間都開嘅，有啲就係 detect for 唔同嘅 chemicals 啦，竟然有啲係 detect for 個 voltage 個 electrical signal，當佢 exceed 某一個，咁佢先至會開。咁所以咧，就當呢一紮 channels opens，即係 second phase 呢一度嘅時候，佢 opens increase 個 potential。咁當佢 exceed 呢個 threshold，佢就會令到個 potential 足夠打開呢一紮嘅 voltage gated 嘅 sodium channels。咁呢紮 sodium channels 咧開咗之後咧，就更加多嘅 sodium ions goes in。咁所以你就會見到一個 sudden increase in membrane potential。咁呢個 membrane potential even overshoot zero， 得唔得？已經變成正添啊！呢一橛由原先嘅負啦，你冇咁負啦，然之後就 overshoot 變成一個正嘅potential。OK， 咁當呢個係 rising phase 嘅時候咧，喺 membrane 度咧，我哋冇唔記得仲有另一個 channel protein 嘅，另一個類型嘅 channel proteins 就係 potassium ion 嘅 channels。咁咧 potassium ion 嘅 channels 咧，亦都係 voltage gated 嘅，但係佢當佢係高，即係negative 呢個voltage 嘅時候，係會閂埋咗。時候咧 ，potassium ions cannot get out of the cell， 所以你就一路有正嘅 ion 入嚟，但係正嘅 ion potassium ion 又出唔翻去，所以你就有個 increase in membrane potential， 呢度有個出現咗一個upshooting 咁樣。呢點嘅，咁呢度發生咩事咧？個 repolarization。So after the potential overshoot zero, some of the sodium ions channels, like what I told you, they are voltage gated. Okay, when the voltage reverse in sign， 由負變成正嘅時候，呢就 voltage gated 嘅 channels closed。The sodium channels closed. When the sodium channels close, then those sodium ions outside of the neuron cannot get into the neuron anymore. And at the same time, 佢閂咗另一個 channels open 喎，咁嗰個 channels 咧就係 potassium ions 嘅 channels. When the potassium ions channels opens, those potassium ions flows out of the cell. Okay, so when potassium ions flows out of the cell, but sodium ions cannot get in， 即係你不停有啲正 charge 嘅 ions 流失緊，咁於是你咪 decrease in membrane potential. This repolarization, the neuron goes into hyperpolarization。咁乜嘢 hyperpolarization 咧？就係原先 resting potential 喺呢度啦，咧就係講緊跌低過呢個 resting potential。係啦，咁我哋知道乜嘢 polarization 啊嘛 ，hyper 即係超過咗啦，係啦。咁呢個過程係點樣發生嘅咧？就係個 potassium channels 喺呢一個potential 嘅時候，依然 remains open， 所以你有多過，即係你有過多嘅 potassium ion get out of the cell， so leads to this type of hyperpolarization。不過之後佢會 restore 翻去呢個 resting membrane potential 咧，因為個 diffusion。And the potassium ions would start to diffuse back into the membrane, and you have the pumps to restore the resting membrane potential. 咁佢就會 goes back to this resting membrane potential， 咁就負70個 millivolt。喺個 neuron 入面。 發生緊啲咩事啦，喺唔同嘅 phases 嘅時候，其實你嚟嚟去去咧見到就係嗰兩個 channels protein potassium 同埋sodium ions 嘅 channels， 佢哋喺唔同嘅情況底下嘅開閂啦，會影響到個 movement of ions going in or out of the neuron， 而導致一個 imbalance of ion， 得唔得？咁有一樣嘢我係好需要 point out 咧，就係 potassium ion 都好啦，係一個正 charge 嘅。如果佢有多啲正 charge 嘅 ions 嘅話 ，when comparing to inside， 咁入面就係 relatively negative， 得唔得？呢個係一個 relative concept， 但當我哋用個咪錶去度嘅時候，我哋定義咗邊一個點為止一個 reference point 為止零嘅時候，咁入面冇咁正嘅就會叫做負啦。
Doctor Lam 想請教下 repolarization 嗰度咧，係咩情況嗰個嘅 sodium channels 係會 close 㗎
？Repolarization 個 sodium ions channels 係 operated by charge 嘅，佢嗰個 channels 本身個開關就係 depends on 個 voltage。咁當你個 voltage 由本身負 overshoot 超過咗零之後 become positive， 呢一啲嘅 channels 就會 close。係啦，咁就好似呢一幅圖咁樣，我哋而家 go through 下呢一幅圖。呢一幅圖咧 show 咗俾我哋睇喺呢一邊嘅 axis 咧，我哋可以睇到個 iron 嘅 permeability 嘅，係啦。咁呢個 iron 嘅 permeability depends on 啲channels 究竟開定閂。見到咧，呢個 rising phase 咧，同個 sodium ions 嘅 permeability 咧係好吻合嘅，得唔得？就係正因為呢個 sodium ion 嘅 channels 咧開咗，啲 sodium ions goes into the neuron， 導致呢一度有個 rising in membrane potential， 得唔得？而落翻嚟嘅時候咧，你會見到咧，同個 potassium ions 嗰個 permeability 亦都係非常之吻合嘅。但係咧，你就會見到個 sodium ion 嘅 permeability 喺呢一橛咧係下降嘅，因為嗰個 channels proteins close。啲 graph 你見 match 翻個 action potential 同埋個 permeability of the ion， 我哋就會知道佢幾時係開咗，幾時係閂咗。我哋而家再高呼下上面呢一紮 channels protein 啦。一開頭嘅時候 ，which is negative in resting potential。咁當佢 resting potential 嘅時候，點解有 resting potential 啊？因為啲 pump 啦，同埋個 diffusion of sodium ions in of out of sodium ions 同 potassium ions in of out of the neuron， 導致有個 imbalance of ions distribution。咁就最終咧就出現咗呢個 negative 嘅 resting membrane potential。咁當有一個 stimulation 嚟到嘅時候啦，可能你掂到啲熱嘢啊 whatever， 任何你有 touch 啊，呢啲 signal 咧就會stimulation。咁呢個 stimulation being picked up by 個 receptor 就會導致到啲sodium ions 嘅 channels open 啊。咁喺呢一橛喺早期即係呢一橛嘅時候咧，個 sodium ions 咧並非 voltage gate 嘅，即係喺呢一橛仔嘅時候，後面嗰張圖就冇分開一個細啲嘅 phase 同埋一個大啲嘅 increase 啊，係啦，咁就係呢一個second phase 嘅時候，呢個 rising 嘅 phase 嘅時候， 呢一紮嘅 sodium ions channel 佢並非 voltage gate，佢係其他嘅 sodium ions channels 嚟嘅。咁當你 pick up 到你 being stimulated 嘅時候，咁嗰個 stimulation 就會開咗呢一紮嘅 sodium ions channels。咁於是就sodium ions goes into the cell， 然之後 increase 呢一個 membrane potential。咁呢個 membrane potential 持續咁樣 increase 咧，就會導致更加多嘅 sodium ions channels 開咗啦。今次呢一紮嘅 sodium ions channels 咧，喺呢一橛嘅位置嘅時候咧，係 voltage gate 嘅，得唔得？當佢過咗呢個 threshold 嘅時候，呢個 voltage 過咗呢個 threshold 嘅時候，咁呢一紮 voltage gate 嘅sodium ions channels 就會開咗啦。咁於是你就好多 sodium ions channels 開咗，咁你咪有個 sudden increase in sodium ion permeability。咁呢隻 sodium ions goes into the neuron, which leads to the increase in membrane potential。咩事咧？就係當佢即係頭先同學問啦，咩情況底下個 sodium ions 嘅 channels close 咧？就係當佢個 membrane potential 咧 overshoot zeros 嘅時候，佢哋就會開始生啦。所以你要見到呢一度個 permeability 開始個斜度冇呢一度咁斜啦，係咪？就係因為有一啲嘅 channels 開始生啦，佢唔會一下子話生得晒，你即刻 drop 落嚟嘅。biological system 都係咁樣咯，但係你見到佢個increase 個幅度已經越嚟越少啦，即係有一啲嘅 channels 開始生緊啦，咁就係因為個 voltage 呢一個 polarity overshoot zeros， 有啲已經開始生緊，然之後就開始慢慢下降翻啦。咁同一時間你就會見到個 action potential 都開始下降。咁當個action potential 開始慢慢下降嘅時候咧，有另一個 voltage gated 嘅 channel，which are potassium ions channels 就開始開咯。於是佢就你會見到個 permeability of potassium ions increases during this phase, and potassium ions when the channels opens, those potassium ions get out of the cell， 咁啦，由個 cell 由個 neuron 嘅入面就走出去出面咯。於是你就有個 decrease in potential 啦，得唔得？跟住由於個 potassium 嘅 permeability 依然維持喺一個好高嘅 level 啦，所以你呢個 potential 會 overshoot a little bit， 跟住再 restore 翻去 resting membrane potential。OK， 咁呢一度我哋就由個 sodium ions and potassium ion 嘅 permeability 嗰度，我哋可以睇到究竟個 action potential 喺唔同嘅位置係點樣受呢啲 channels protein 開生去影響啦。Opening and closing of these channels proteins and the potential, we have two refractory period. Okay, so under the refractory period, the neuron could not, I should not say it this way, is not able to receive a signal as well as when it is under resting membrane potential. Okay, so when the neuron is under absolute refractory period, it cannot respond to another stimulation during that period. Okay, but for relative refractory period, a very strong stimulation can still generate action potential. Okay, 咁呢兩個 period 其實係喺咩時間咧 ？During the generation of the action potential 呢一橛嘅時候係 absolute refractory period， 亦即係話當第一個 signal 喺呢一度啊嘛，第一個 stimulation 喺呢一度啦，我可能揾支針吉下你啦，咁就 即刻就會 generate 一個 action potential。當呢一個 stimulation 導致嘅呢個 action potential 仲喺度製造緊嘅時候，未翻去resting potential 之前咧，呢一橛叫做 absolute refractory period，即係話我再揾支針吉你多一下咧，都唔會有另一個 action potential 出嚟啦。所以太高密度嘅刺激咧，有時我哋係冇辦法分別到嘅。咁嗰個因為就係個 neuron still under absolute refractory period。嘅 refractory period 咧，就係講緊個 membrane potential 已經開始要 restore 翻去個 resting membrane potential。咁佢喺呢一橛嘅時候，當你係一個好 strong 嘅 stimulation，你都仲可以 generate 有 action potential。咁好容易理解嘅啫，就係呢一個係個 threshold 啊嘛，-55係個 threshold。你個 stimulation 一定要過到-55先至可以 generate 一個 full height 嘅 action potential。咁但係當你 below 你個 resting potential 呢一橛嘅時候，你一定要強度強過先前呢一個 stimulation，先至有機會超過呢個 threshold。OK， 咁呢一橛嘅時，當個 neuron 係個 membrane potential 係 within 呢一個 range 嘅時候，咁佢係 under 個 relative refractory period，咁你都仲可以 receive another stimulation 嘅，得唔得？但個強度一定要夠強先至可以 generate 個 action potential。咁 generate 唔到個 action potential 會發生咩事咧？冇嘅，就係 all or nothing 啊嘛，就係冇嘢發生咯。係啊，就係好似我冇揾針吉過你一樣咯。跟住我哋就會講下而家 generate 到呢一個 action potential 啦。咁呢個 action potential 喺呢一個位置點樣 pass along the nerve？頭先已經講到個 neuron 咁長啦，可以。咁我而家揾支大頭針吉下你腳趾，咁吉完之後 generate 到嗰個 action potential 啊。咁嗰個 action potential 都要由你腳趾度傳到去個 spinal cord，再傳上去個 brain 度㗎，係咪？咁呢一個 propagation of signal 又係點樣發生嘅咧？咁樣，咁我就俾個 break 你哋，然之後我哋就翻嚟再講啦。咁 let's have 5 minutes break. So we'll start again at 8:09 then, okay? Let's resume. So previously we talked about how the action potential is being generated, okay, by opening sodium ions or closing the sodium ions or potassium ions channels at different time under different stimulation. Okay, so now after that action potential is being generated, how the action potential is being transmitted and propagated along this neuron, okay, is what we are going to discuss right now. Okay， 咁就頭先講咗喺嗰一個位置 receive 到個 stimulation， 你當係你手指尖而家 touch whatever 嘢都好啦，你摸緊啲嘢嘅時候，嗰個 signal 嗰個 stimulation 喺你手指尖度 generate 咗。咁呢個喺手指尖 generate 咗嘅 action potential needs to go through being transmitted, right？ 咁究竟又係發生咩事咧？咁好啦，而家我哋當喺呢一個位置 receive 咗個stimulation， 咁入面咧 generate 咗個 action potential become positive 啦。當入面 become positive 嘅時候，出面就 become relatively negative， 即係 relative concepts all around。當入面係 positive 嘅時候，佢隔離仲係 negative 噶嘛，係咪？咁呢個 positive charge 就會令到佢 adjacent 隔離嘅呢一個位置咧，佢個 charge spread out， 因為呢個 charge 係點嚟啊？由於啲 ions 啫嘛，啲 ions 係唔係死噶嘛，即係唔係定喺嗰度噶嘛，佢會 diffuse out spread out。咁於是呢度嘅 positive charge spread to neighboring region 係咪？咁當佢 spread 過嚟嘅時候，呢一個 immediate neighboring region would be depolarized 嘅 charge become less negative charge。咁於是咧呢一個位置咧會發生咩事咧？就係發生呢一個情況。咁開始佢就會 become less negative， 跟住overshoot 呢個 threshold。More sodium ions channels open, generate an action potential。咁於是咧，本身呢一個位置出現嘅 action potential， 導致佢隔離呢一度又再出現一個 action potential。咁呢一度 become positive 之後，又會令到佢隔離又 become positive， 所以就會形成一個好似骨牌效應咁啊，連續地開佢隔離同埋閂佢隔離嘅 sodium ions channels 或者 potassium ions channels， 咁一路咁樣 propagate 落去。好啦，咁佢就會spread， 然之後 transmitted propagated along the axon, okay, and until it reached the end of this neuron。咁如果我哋有好長嘅一條 axon 啦，頭先講話一開頭嘅時候，我哋捉啲深海八爪魚噶嘛，咁啲腳好長啦，咁個 axon 亦都非常之長啦。咁我哋如果喺唔同嘅位置嗰度擺個 electro 去度個 potential 咧，咁我哋就會發現咧，如果我喺呢個位置去 stimulate 佢啦，咁好快喺1、2、3、4、5、6、7、8，咁一路落去嘅 electron， 你都可以 detect 到個 action potential， 因為喺呢一個位置嘅 positive charge spread out leads to the depolarization at the neighboring region and opens the sodium ions channels to allow ions to get in and later enter into a repolarization. So it will lead to the generation of action potential along the axon of the neuron。喺度必須要point out 第一，你見唔見到個 action potential 一路都係同一個 height， 同一個 potential。咁呢個就係 all or nothing。Okay? 佢 either 有或者冇，佢有嘅話就一定係 一個 full length full amplitude 嘅 action potential。個開山啲 channels protein 去達至呢一個 action potential 嘅，所以佢有嘅話，佢一定會係 same amplitude，okay? Without any diminish in the amplitude of this membrane potential。呢個係nerve impulse 啦，transmission of the signals along the action 佢其中一個最重要嘅 feature。Okay? So there are a few factors that are going to affect the speed of signal conduction, how these signals are being transmitted from one end to another end. Okay, so first of all, 電線越粗嘅話 ，resistance 越低，咁 signal transduction 越快。Neurons would conduct action potential faster. Is whether the axon is being myelinated or not. Okay, so this would need some explanation. 頭先我哋講咗咧個 action potential 咧要 propagate transmit 落去下一個嘅時候，係要透過不停去開山佢 neighboring region 嘅 sodium ion channels 或者 potassium ion channels，right？ 呢啲開山唔同嘅 channels 咧係需要時間嘅，你越長或者你越多 channels 係需要開山嘅話，你需要嘅時間越耐啦，係咪？咁但係咧，當個 axons 係 being wrapped around with the Schwann cell or being myelinated， 佢呢一啲包住咗嘅位置係冇 sodium ions channels， 亦都冇 potassium ions channels 嘅，所以佢就被逼呢一個positive charge 咧要 spread 去影響下一個位置嘅時候，就要影響呢一個位置先至可以開山到啲 sodium ions channels， 因為係呢一橛位置先至有 sodium ions channel 嘛。Okay， 所以就形成咗個好似 jump from node to node 咁樣 ，instead of 呢度又要開山，佢而家淨係開呢一個位置，所以你就會減低咗你需要開山嘅 sodium ions channels 嘅數目，從而加快咗個signal transmission。Pulmonary 嘅conduction。佢係好似 jumping around 咁啊 ，instead of 你不停要開山。咁另外咧，myelination which are mainly consists of fat wrapping around the axon, it is a very good signal electrical insulator. So avoid the leak of those signals. So kind of ensure those the generation of these maximum amplitude action potential. Okay, so for those patients who are having degenerated myelination, signals would leak out, and finally, these leaks out signals won't be able to stimulate the generation of the action potential when it comes to this node here. Therefore, the signal dies out. Okay, nothing happens because signals could not generate a full action potential here and cannot pass the threshold. Therefore, or nothing happens. Okay. 1 minute to finish this check your understanding question. What is your answer? The axon is wrapped around with the myelin sheath, and also the diameter of the axon, the thicker the neuron, the faster the signal transmission and resistance as well. Okay, so by the way, what would actually affect the resistance of the neuron? 大細就好容易理解啦 ，resistance 有乜嘢會影響個 resistance 啊？個 resistance 嘅for example 個 axon 入面個 water content 啦，得唔得？你多啲水定多啲 ions 啊？你入面個 composition 呢啲全部會影響個 resistance 嘅。得唔得？你有多啲 charge molecule 嘅話，就容易啲 conduct 個 signal。得唔得？如果你好 dehydrated 冇乜水嘅話，咁個 resistance 亦都會提高咗。係有一啲同neuroscience 方面有關嘅疾病咧，個 patient 咧喺個大腦或者喺啲 neuron 入面咧，佢哋會不停製造一啲不能夠被降解嘅蛋白質嘅，咁佢就會 aggregated，然之後喺入面，即係你可以諗下就係當你個 neurons 入面有好多蛋白質，而啲蛋白質係一啲 bad protein， 佢又 aggregate 黐埋一齊，但係咧佢又唔可以被 degraded 嘅話，咁就好似你有好多垃圾喺個 neuron 入面，咁你個 signal 要 go through 嘅時候，佢就會提升咗個 resistance 啊。So far, we have talked about the generation of action potential, and we also talked about how the signal is then being propagated past along the axon. Okay, now let's talk about the third theme of impulse transduction in the nervous system, which is the transmission across the synapse. Okay, so what is a synapse? A synapse is a junction between two neurons. Okay, 呢兩個 neurons 佢哋唔係 physically connected 嘅。咩叫 physically connected 啊？如果我而家要駁條電線嘅話，我會將電線 A 出面嗰層膠搣走佢，電線 B 出面層膠又搣走啲。跟住將佢哋完全咁翹埋一齊，咁就叫做 physically connected。咁喺一個 physically connected 嘅情況底下，我 electrical signal can be passed from wire A to wire B without any problem， 係咪 ？But 喺neuron 嘅情況底下咧，佢哋係並非 physically connected 嘅，佢哋中間係有個 gap 喺度嘅，而呢一個 junction 咧就係個 synapse。於是第一個問題我哋要問嘅就係個 electrical signal 點樣 jump from one neuron to another neuron 咧？係咪？即係而家我喺我電線 A 駁咗電，我凌空要將啲電過落電線 B， 究竟發生咩事咧？咁喺 neuron 嘅情況咧，係有啲好神奇嘅嘢發生嘅，中間係涉及一啲 chemical substance。所以由 electrical signal 變做 chemical signal， 再變翻做 electrical signal， 就係將呢個 signal transmit 去下一個 neuron 嘅關鍵啦。OK， 咁而家 before 我哋講究竟發生咩事之前，我哋先講一講呢三個唔同嘅 terms。首先有 presynaptic cells，which is kind of obvious. It is the cell that before the synapse。Okay, and the signal is being transmitted from these presynaptic cells and need to get from this presynaptic cell to the next cell, which is the postsynaptic cells. Okay, the postsynaptic cells would be the cells that receive the signal. And this junction, the cleft, 呢個斷崖式呢個 junction 就係佢哋要 jump across 嘅地方。咁呢個 this narrow space is the synaptic cleft. Okay, and this whole region is a synapse. So now let's have a look at what is synapse. We have neurons here, and this is the axon terminal, meaning that the axon has already reached its end. Okay, and inside this axon, we can find a lot of visco. Okay, so this is a presynaptic cells. The action potential reach this terminal, and this cell we can find a lot of viscos there, which contain neurotransmitter. Okay, this neurotransmitter is a chemical. Reach the terminal in the presynaptic cell, the change in potential, the arrival of the action potential would stimulate the release, the migration of these viscos, which containing the neurotransmitter, to migrate towards this side, and they would fuse with the membrane and release the content. And the content contain this chemical, the neurotransmitter. And the neurotransmitter would be having high concentration near these presynaptic cells, right? Concentration 喺呢一邊較會高啲啦，因為佢 release 出嚟㗎嘛。So the neurotransmitter would diffuse across diffuse across 咁喺呢一邊又有啲咩咧？喺呢一邊嘅 membrane 咧，有啲 neurotransmitter 嘅 receptor. Neurotransmitter would bind with the receptor on the postsynaptic cell. 咁當佢哋 bind 完之後，又發生咩事咧 ？bind 咗之後咧，佢就會開咗啲 sodium ions receptor， 跟住 initiate the action potential。所以個 chemical signal become electrical signal again. Okay, so let's go through it once more. For the presynaptic cells, we can find a lot of viscos containing neurotransmitter. And on the postsynaptic cells, we can find the receptors for the neurotransmitter. Okay, so when the action potential arrive at the terminal at the end here, the arrival of the action potential would lead to the opening of calcium ions channels. Okay, and the calcium ions in this fluid would goes into the presynaptic cell, and with the influx of calcium ions, it would induce those viscos to migrate towards this membrane. Okay, 所以咧就係話，當個 action potential 一嚟到呢一個位置嘅時候，到達呢個action terminal 嘅時候，咁佢會開咗呢個 membrane 呢一個 membrane 入面嘅calcium ions channels， 咁所以啲 calcium ions 又由呢度入咗去，咁於是喺呢一個位置嗰個 concentration 咪高啲啊，又係啲 concentration 嘢啦。咁呢個 influx of calcium ions 會導致啲 viscos 開始 migrate towards。
Dr. Lam 又冇聲啊。
OK， 咁呢啲 lipid 咧就會 fuse with the cell membrane to release， 得唔得？咁呢個 neurotransmitter would then diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind with the receptor on the postsynaptic cleft。
Dr. Lam 可唔可以講多次？頭先冇聲咧，聽唔到。
你哋喺邊度聽唔到啊？Sorry。
講呢幅圖嗰陣時，講到一半嘅時候就 冇咗聲咁樣。
好，咁我由第一點呢個開始講翻好。咁個 action potential when it arrives to the action terminal, the action potential would leads to the opening of calcium ions on the membrane and leads to the influx of calcium ions into the axon. And this influx of calcium ions causes those viscose to migrate to the cell membrane here and fuse with the cell membrane. And when the viscose fuse with the cell membrane, content is being released out. And what's inside the viscose are the neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters would diffuse across this synaptic cleft and bind with the receptors on the postsynaptic cells, on the postsynaptic cells. Okay, so once those transmitter is released out and diffused to the postsynaptic cells and bind with those receptors on the postsynaptic cells, it will open the ion channels again, okay, which includes the sodium ion channels. So everything occurs before occurs again, okay? When the receptors bind with the neurotransmitter, the sodium ion channels opens. So sodium ions goes into the cell, leads to the depolarization of the postsynaptic cells, okay? When the postsynaptic cells is being depolarized and when the voltage is higher than the threshold, another action potential is being generated. And that action potential would then pass along the postsynaptic cells and goes on before it reach another synapse. Okay? And for the neurotransmitter, it would be broken down in the postsynaptic cell and diffuse back to the presynaptic cell. Transmitter, after broken down, diffuse back to the presynaptic cells, and the presynaptic cells would uptake this raw material or broken down neurotransmitter and use that to make the neurotransmitter package in the viscose so that it can be recycled and used again. Give you 1 minute. The synapse. Okay, any suggestion? The neurons, okay, the cleft, the gap, the junctions between the neurons. It is not a type of reflex action. We're going to talk about reflex action very soon. The signal produced under stimulation, no, that is action potential. The neurotransmitter pass from one neuron to another, no, okay. It is the junction, the gap, the space between neurons. 係啦，我哋講咗個 action potential 係嗰個點 under stimulation 點樣 being generated，跟住佢點樣 disrupt 佢 neighboring 嘅嗰個charge 嗰個 potential，導致佢嗰啲 sodium ions channel 開，跟住有啲 ions sodium ions goes in。令佢可以 generate 另一個 action potential， 於是者就一路 propagate 落去。咁當佢去到個尾嘅時候，佢要 jump across the cleft, the junction, the gap, the synapse 嘅時候 this electrical signal would induce the release of the neurotransmitter, which diffuse from the presynaptic cells to the postsynaptic cells. 咁一個 postsynaptic cells 嗰度個 neurotransmitter bind 咗去就 open 個 postsynaptic cells 嘅 sodium ions channel。咁前面發生嘅嘢喺 postsynaptic cells 又再次發生，於是就成個 signal 就可以由個 receptor 嗰度 transmit to the next neuron。OK， 咁而家就講個 reflex 啊。What is a reflex? Is any response, any signal and output that occurs automatically and without involving the brain. Okay, 冇 involve 個 brain 你就唔需要 thinking 噶啦，因為 thinking comes from the brain. So, like some of you suggest before, spinal reflex is same as reflex. Okay, so reflex involve the spinal cord only. Okay, does not involve the brain. Okay, but it involves the CNS because the spinal cord is part of the CNS. So what is a reflex? Reflex art starts from the sensory receptor. Okay, signal comes from the sensory receptor, picked up by the sensory receptor, transmitted through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. And inside spinal cord, we have the interneuron there. Okay, and after the signal is being integrated in the spinal cord, it gets back down the motor neuron and to the effector. Okay, this is a reflex art. You can see the brain is not involved at all. And we have different reflex action in our body. One is the taping of the kneecap. Okay, 敲個膝頭哥嘅時候，你個腳係會彈嘅，即係如果你唔 control， 你唔同自己講話唔好喐隻腳嘅話咧，理論上佢係一定會自己彈起。OK， 咁個for the reflex action, you can see the signal that is being taken up by the sensory receptor, which in this case is a stretch receptor. Detect for any signal for the stretching of the of the skeletal muscle, and this signal goes along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, and there goes down the motor neuron back to the muscle again to output that kick action. Okay, and this is a 2 neuron reflex art. You can see only 2 neuron is being involved. The interneuron is not involved in this case. Although the signal goes into the spinal cord, the interneuron is not involved. And we have a 3 neuron reflex art, which involves the interneuron. So it is the very famous withdrawal action. Okay, when we are having maybe a sharp, touching a sharp object or hot object, then we'll have these 3 neuron reflex art, withdrawal action. The signal being picked up by the sensory neuron goes, sensory receptor goes along the sensory neuron and pass through the interneuron, and then action is being produced through the signal passing along the motor neuron to the effector. Okay, so it involves 3 neurons. So it is a 3 neuron reflex art. But both reflex art, you can see the brain is not involved. Okay, only a spinal cord is being involved for this type of reflex. Withdrawal action going through the reflex art. So when you touch something hot, the sensory receptors on the skin of your hand pick up that signal, pass through. That signal is being passed along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, and an action is being produced. This action is a reflex action, so the brain is not involved. But you always know that you touch something hot, right? Although your brain is not involved in this withdrawal action, but you know that you have touched something hot because we have neurons that connecting the brain with these sensory neurons, and these neurons would conduct these signals up to the brain. And when the brain detects that signal, it knows that you have touched something hard. But the brain is not involved in this withdraw action. Am I clear? 咁啦，呢個 withdraw action 係唔需要 involve 個 brain 嘅，你只要掂到任何熱嘅嘢，你自然就有呢個 reflex action。但係你依然會知道你掂到熱嘅嘢，因為我哋有 nerve 係 connect 呢個 sensory neuron with the brain。咁個 brain 收到個信息之後，佢就會知道你掂到熱嘢。但係呢個 reflex 呢個 hand withdraw 嘅 action 係唔需要透過個腦思考完之後先話withdraw 個手啦，得唔得？咁於是咧，如果有人咧係 by accident 啦，即係呢一個 neuron going up to the brain 係 kind of damage 啦，可能 car accident whatever， 佢依然有 reflex action，OK，but 佢唔會知道佢 touch something hard。掂到熱嘢之後，個大腦 generate 出嚟話我掂到熱嘢，得唔得？如果你蒙住佢對眼啦，即係我哋見到佢滾緊嘅時候，嗰個係另一個 visual 嘅 input 話俾你聽係熱啦。但係如果你蒙住佢眼，佢掂到熱嘅，佢會 withdraw， 但佢唔知道自己掂到熱嘅，係啊。自己縮手，因為我哋有其他 brain 嘅 proportion 會知道我哋相對即係啲四肢係邊個位置嘅。係喺個 three-dimensional space 喺邊個位置，但佢唔會知道自己掂到熱嘅嘢，係啦。如果佢呢一個位置係 being damage 嘅話 for this withdraw action involve the leg very similar. Okay, so we have a pathway going to the brain which interprets this signal and let us comprehend and understand what is happening. But the reflex action itself does not involve the brain. Okay?
我睇咧，想請問其實彈琴同埋打字都係唔 involve 個 brain 咁，因為練習得多咧，佢自然都會個自然反射反應去咁樣去做到出嚟。其實係咪同一個效果都係？唔係，你練得多，你習以為常，個大腦嘅回路咧，所有 pathway 佢係已經 well established 咗，唔代表你係一個 reflex action。reflex action 就係講緊你淨係 involve 個 spinal cord， 你彈琴係 involve 個 brain， 得唔得？你練到幾熟都好啦，只係好 efficiently， 你個大腦就會用一個最快、最便捷嘅方法去做嗰樣嘢，係啦。咁所以你會覺得好輕鬆咁樣咯，但係佢依然係 involve 個 brain， 佢唔係個 reflex action。所以平時所講嘅反射動作啊，或者我練到好熟，完全係本能反應嗰啲係呃人嘅，即係唔可以講呃人嘅。我都已經有唔係我哋嘅 definition 所講嘅 reflex action。哦 ，OK， 明白，唔該你。
Okay. So, yep, check your understanding. Which of the following is a reflex response? Of 你個 brain 去 determine 去解讀究竟嗰本書喺個 three-dimensional space 嘅邊一個位置，跟住你要 take 一個乜嘢嘅 action， 嗰個唔係一個 reflex action 嚟嘅，嗰個 involve brain 嘅 action 就唔會係spinal reflex。Okay? System is not involved in producing reflex action. Very obvious, right? Okay, so it is the brain, okay? Not the CNS. The spinal cord is part of the CNS, okay? So the CNS is involved, but only the spinal cord. So in summary, what we have discussed today is we talk about the organization of the nervous system, and we also talk about how the permeability and also the sodium potassium pump is being involved in maintaining the resting membrane potential of the neuron. And we talk about how the action potential is being generated under stimulation. And after that, we talk about how that action potential generated under stimulation is propagated, transmitted along the axon. If it is in myelinated axon, then it would be in the form of a jumping fraction, a saltatory fraction transmission. And after that, we talk about how the electrical signal is transmitted from the presynaptic cells to the postsynaptic cells by releasing the neurotransmitter in the presynaptic cells, which diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind with the receptor in the postsynaptic cells to open the sodium ions channel on the postsynaptic cells. Finally, we talk about the reflex action, which do not involve the brain and brings us very fast and standard response. So each time when you touch something hot, you give a very fast withdrawal, okay? And that does not involve any learning. We're born with that response, and that is kind of standard. Everyone would do that response in a very standard way. Okay. Okay, so any question? Let me go through the chat to see if you have any question. Jumping from node to node. 頭先有同學話可唔可以 clarify 係 calcium ion 定 sodium ion？OK， 咁即係我再講多次個 synapse 呢一個位好冇？當個 action potential 咁佢去到呢一個 opening of calcium ions channel 喺呢個位置係 calcium ions channel in the presynaptic cell。當啲 channels open calcium ions 喺呢啲 liquid 入面就會 goes into the cell。當個 calcium ions 走咗入去之後咧，呢啲viscose would migrate towards this end, fused with the cell membrane, release the neurotransmitter. And that diffuse across, bind with the receptor there, open the sodium ions channel in the postsynaptic cells. OK， 好啦，跟住就 action potential 點樣 jump node from node。啲 axon 係冇包住啲myelin shell 嘅，即係出面係完全冇包住任何嘢。咁佢個 transmission 就要不停咁樣影響佢個 neighboring region 個 potential open 嗰啲 sodium ions， 等啲 sodium ions 可以走入去，然之後establish 一個 action potential， 然之後再影響佢。隔離，再隔離，再隔離咁啊，係咪？咁而喺有包住個 myelin 嘅情況底下咧，包住嘅嗰啲位置，呢啲全部都係 membrane， 跟住包住嘅呢啲全部都係 lipid， 係冇任何 sodium ions channels， 冇任何 potassium ions channel。咁於是對於呢一個位置嘅隔離就會係呢一個 node 啦，得唔得？佢個 ions 會 diffuse 過嚟，然之後喺呢一個位置先至可以開閂到佢啲 sodium ions channel。所以當佢開到啲 sodium ions channel 嘅時候 ，sodium ions 先至可以喺呢個位置入去，喺呢個位置 generate 個 action potential。所以就好似 jump node from node 咁樣啦。OK， 得唔得啊？聽唔聽到㗎？ if yeah, okay, thank you. So if you are fine, then we would conclude today's lesson here. Okay, so yeah, see you on. Yeah, okay. Yeah, see you next lecture then. Okay.